So I can start out by just saying thank you for having me. It's a real privilege and an honor to be in a room with such creative people, people really on the edge of what I think are important and valuable questions about what a state of human becoming is. I've enjoyed every talk that I've heard today, so I just want to thank the MTA conference for having me and all the other speakers while I wait for my slides to get ready. How's everyone doing today? Great, good crowd. So today's talk is Cultivating Esoteric Experience as Mundane. So I want to start out with a little bit of context. Why am I here? And not just here at this conference, but doing the kind of work that I do. For a lot of people like me, and like a lot of our other speakers, it often begins with a really personal story. So on the left here, there's a photo of me in India when I was 19 years old. I had a experience as a teenager that is unfortunately much too common in the United States. I experienced depression, all sorts of mental illness, anxiety. I essentially dropped out of high school for a brief period. And this is a trend that's only increasing as time goes on. There could be myriad causes. But fortunately, there was an intervention that happened for me, and that was discovering meditative practices, actually, a variety of meditative practices, and using those to incorporate a more holistic approach to mental health that led to me being able to have a new lease on life. I went to India after discovering, wow, meditation is really powerful. And I there encountered people doing things that I think we don't even normally associate with meditation. And that's going to be one of the themes of this talk, is really pressing the boundaries of what you think meditation is. I got some, teacher training and stuff like that. I went to undergrad at Boston University, achieved some accolade or awards to the religion department. Went to Harvard Divinity School. I've been presenting at conferences over the past few years on esoteric experiences and a cognitive science of religion approach to them. And then this is a photo from a conference that happened this past June, where my organization recently formed. Also, Thomas McConkie was there, so thank you for being there. We hosted a conference bringing together speakers from different religious traditions, different disciplines, different perspectives on meditation practice and education, research, so on. Today, though, I'm not just talking about meditation like mindfulness or any of the other associations that you might normally have with that word. I'm talking about the esoteric. Esoteric. By definition, it's the unknown. It's the thing that is excluded from the conversation, whether it's excluded because it's just not accessible to the mainstream audience, or it's intentionally locked behind forms of initiation or ritual or other kinds of achievement. But within these esoteric experiences, I think we have lessons to learn about what could be, in many ways, mundane, that could be by that, I mean repeatable, that could be a part of what we consider everyday life. That's the really exciting takeaway that I hope emerges as we meander through these different case studies. To start us off, Hugh of St. Victor. This is about as esoteric as it gets. Only medievalists typically know what I'm talking about when I mention Hugh of St. Victor. He is a 12th century monk, essentially. And he built this training program. He called it the Ark. At that time, and for a couple hundred years afterward, many Christian medieval scholars or mystics were really interested in memory. Memory was the gateway to becoming a better Christian, becoming a better Catholic, or, basically, it was the way of having a more scholastic, a more meaningful life, was encoding all of this information inside of you. And then what do you do with it? So as our good friend Hugh St. Victor said, it is of no use to understand something if you are unable or unwilling to remember it. With this program that he developed, it was inspired by the method of loci, or the memory palace. Who here has heard of the memory palace before? Okay, good. So we've got some traction there. The memory palace was invented supposedly in ancient Greece by a poet who used it in order to memorize large poems based on where people were placed in a room. This is the creation story of the memory palace. Back in the 12th century and 13th century, memory palaces were used for people to memorize large portions of the Bible, religious texts, any kind of important information, even math, science, physics at the time. This was encoded by imagining a landscape in your mind, a house, a mansion, making it really interesting, and then using objects, symbols that relate to the thing you're trying to remember, trying to make those as salient as possible and placing that throughout your house. Now, what Hugh of St. Victor did was he said, okay, that's great, but let's not just memorize these things. Let's build an entire structure, an entire diagram dedicated to the Bible inside of our minds, and not just that sacred text, but all forms of sacred texts and important parts of our relationship with God. So what you can see on the right here is a theologian, Conrad Rudolph's recreation of the Ark. Unfortunately, we have no actual illustrations of the Ark, just textual descriptions. And this is what Hugh of St. Victor expected people, and actually, I think this is not even doing it justice. He expected people not just to make this, but if you get closer, the levels of detail and intricacy only increase. By creating this ark inside people's minds, they were not just memorizing texts. They were building a house for God to be a part of who they are, to be a part of every waking moment, and to make that more salient. The idea was that followed by making this ark, one would live a lifestyle where those precepts, those guidances were always available in a really deep and internal way that was actually closer to, for them, their identity than just pieces of information. All right, next case study, Magid of Joseph Caro. So Joseph Caro was a 15th century Lurianic Kabbalist. Basically, these are Jewish mystics and scholars who are doing these sometimes very complex and advanced rituals, probably not including psychedelics, but perhaps it's really unclear sometimes. But they were having incredible experiences, and in many ways doing them through techniques that you would not find particularly psychedelic now. So for example, Joseph Caro, I think, is a really interesting study of this. So Caro was visited by an angelic power designated by scholars as Magid, or angel, who revealed to him some matters of Kabbalah and rebukes or admonishes him on several issues related to his behavior. This was an angel that then stayed with Joseph Caro for the rest of his life. But what's really interesting is not this mystical experience, but what happened to, or what preceded this experience for Joseph Caro. And it was a practice of training. Joseph Caro, for, I believe, the experience that he had when he first encountered the Magid was preceded by 4 days of oral recitation of the Mishnah, a Jewish code of laws and regulations for how to live a good and just life. For 4 days, he was part of a group where everyone was doing this practice, reciting the Mishnah, and this was something that was actually relatively popular amongst a few other Kabbalists at the time. This experience culminated with him, at least on this occasion, encountering this being who in many ways, for him, was an embodiment of the Mishnah, was now this text codified inside of him as a being that he was able to interact with and was able to experience as, just another agent in the world. So the takeaway here is that it was an aspect of training that led to this experience. But most importantly, actually, I want to highlight that what may have scaffolded this was the culture that he was around that was lending credibility to the idea that, yes, this voice is not going to be a hallucination. This is not a schizophrenic experience. They didn't have that terminology. This was accepted, and this was supported by that particular culture. Third case study, astral projection. Has anyone heard of astral projection before? Show of hands. Okay, great. So these are still pretty esoteric concepts. I think this is a well-informed crowd about esotericism. So astral projection, in particular, the way that I'm approaching it, I'm using the case study from around the 19th century and turn of the 20th century, where we had this group, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn. This was a Western occultic group that was popularizing techniques. I mean, when I say popularizing, probably not too popular, but they were sharing these techniques, which were training guides on how one could move from having no strange experiences whatsoever in one's life to leaving one's body through some kind of, sometimes described as a subtle body or as a projection of their consciousness or even just their sense perception, projecting that into other realms, other parts of the world, all sorts of places. And this was a technique that was trainable. It was done through ritual behavior. It was done by often meditating on particular kinds of images, on imagining particular kinds of sensations, such as closing their eyes and trying to feel the air 2 feet in front of them, for example. Imagine if you did that for an hour a day for a few months. Something strange might happen to you. And that's that's sort of one of my points here. Um, and and actually, so the scholar I'm citing here, Egil Asprim, from a 2017 paper, he did something really interesting in studying astral projection practice, particularly moving into the modern world where this is still popular in some kinds of pocket practitioner groups, where he essentially broke down this system of training that's happening here. So first, we have the internalization of esoteric concepts. These are let's use the example of the Hugh of St. Victor. These are learning about the sacred texts and bringing them inside of oneself, really becoming familiar with them on a deep level. It's the practice of meditative techniques focused on attention, bodily posture, etc., mental imagery, like with Yosef Caro. This could be him entering into a trance state as he repeatedly rehearses the Mishnah and maybe even is being encouraged by his community to imagine what would it be like if God was really here or if a messenger of God was really here. And then is the development of new models either for oneself, where now I am a person who lives in a world where there is an angel inside of me that will sometimes speak to the rest of the world. That's a new self model. I don't currently live with that one. And any number of other self models, such as I am capable of experiencing a sight that I've never seen before through a body that I don't physically have. But what's really fascinating is how this moves into a kind of theory that I actually now rely on to imagine how these esoteric experiences are actually quite repeatable. And that is using it's called predictive coding theory. And it uses an idea of what's the way to say this? Essentially, as we move through the world, we're building these schemas inside of our minds. And as we have these prior probabilities that we think, okay, it's very likely when I tap on that the glass or plastic will resist my hand. Well, then I tap on it and my hand goes through. Well, now I need to make a new hypothesis about what this is. And I go back and I have now updated my priors. Well, what if I now, instead of actually tapping on this, I spend hours and hours imagining tapping on this glass or plastic. And then when I imagine this, I don't imagine that this is just room temperature. I imagine it's scalding hot. If I do that for long enough, I will create this new schema that, even though it's entirely a mental representation, will be a very real thing inside of my mind. Just by practice, just by experiencing the world through our imagination, which, as I think a couple other, or I think this was highlighted in your talk earlier, that much of what we experience through the world, we don't experience sense perception directly. We experience our appraisals of it. And so if you focus on the appraisals, which is perhaps what many of these people are doing, you can update those schemas. And just to kind of show what I mean, Egil Asperman has this great breakdown. I think I can do a little bit of this. So, for example, someone entering into a ritual space reduces the opportunity for distractions, which are confusing signals for their sense perception. They create a designer environment where everything is optimized for them to expect whatever this esoteric experience is designed to create, whether it's the angel or astral projection or any number of other things. They shift to top-down processing by reducing the amount of their rational thought processes. They start priming those expectations by undergoing rituals that they have already begun to associate with particular experiences. They use materials to anchor them. They activate internal models by recalling certain images. I think that's a great allusion, or in this case, allusion to Hugh of St. Victor. And as a result, over time, going through this practice, they can begin to feel these internal models are more and more real as they can change their predictive modeling of the world to rely on those models. So I like to come to a close by thinking about more, what does this mean? We've talked a lot about potential, human potential today, and states of becoming. And I think that is probably the most important takeaway for what I've discussed with you all today, is how these are practices that are, at their baseline, transformative. You don't walk around with an entire compendium of sacred texts in your head that even feel like they are the personified body of God without undergoing some kind of essential shift in who you are as a being. You don't walk around with a chastising angel, which according to Joseph Caro's journal, the angel was like an admonishing mother, constantly telling you how to live a better life without changing your behaviors, without becoming a different person. And I think it's really hard to have an experience where you astral project, probably very similar to psychedelic experiences, without suddenly seeing the world as radically different. And so that's what I want to say we can unlock by thinking more deeply about these esoteric experiences, and not just these esoteric experiences, but thinking about experiences that we often sign off as mystical and unique, not recreatable by the general public, because we don't realize that those people who are clearly qualitatively different from us, people who encounter all sorts of entities or have all sorts of experiences, I'm not doing that, but perhaps I could. Perhaps through training, those things could become mundane. And as we look towards the future, I don't want us just to think about this shift as a fun idea and as how this shapes who those people are on a deep ontological level, but I want us to also think about what could this mean in terms of possibilities. One of the applications is in new kinds of mental health treatments. This is something that's near and dear to my heart. If we could help people learn how to tame the voices in their heads instead of fight them, even see it as a benefit or a skill that allows them to tap into hidden knowledge about themselves, or if we learn how forms of these practices, such as these memory palaces taken to the umpteenth level, could unlock new forms of human genius, new forms of creativity, how we could train children to be able to better interact not just with their minds and the preservation of their mental health that will allow them to do better in school in general, which I wish I had spent more time in high school now, but can allow them to achieve new levels that we would consider the baseline. And that's what I see as really possible with the kind of research that my group does and the kind of questions I'm really interested in asking and someday finding answers with others with, is how can we move this dial? That's my talk. This is the esoteric experience as mundane. Thank you so much, everyone, for having me. And I would love to connect with anyone who's interested in talking more about this. Thank you.